In 1286, a fleet of Venetian merchant ships carried more salt through the Adriatic Sea than some kingdoms collected in annual tax revenue. Salt was so valuable in medieval Europe that cities fought wars over it. Monks built entire economies around it, and the word salary itself traces back to the Latin salarium, the salt allowance paid to Roman soldiers centuries earlier. By 1400, the average European household had figured out how to keep raw pork edible for an entire winter, store fish caught in the North Sea for months before it ever reached an inland dinner table, and turn a barrel of fresh cabbage into something that would last until the following spring. No freezers, no plastic wrap, no chemical preservatives. And the methods they used were so effective that many of them are still the basis of foods you eat right now, whether you realize it or not. It was the year 1066, and across most of medieval Europe, the single biggest threat to a family's survival had nothing to do with war or disease. It was spoilage. A pig slaughtered in late autumn could feed a household through the cold months, but only if the meat didn't rot within a week. Fresh milk would sour in a day. A catch of herring brought inland from the coast would turn foul before it traveled 40 miles on a dirt road in the summer heat. Every meal that spoiled was a meal that couldn't be replaced. And in a world where one bad harvest could mean starvation, wasting food wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. So, medieval kitchens became laboratories of preservation. Not in the way we think of laboratories today with instruments and controlled experiments, but through generations of trial and error, passed down from mothers to daughters, from monastery cellars to castle kitchens, from fishing villages to royal courts. The techniques they developed weren't primitive. They were brilliant. Salt, the foundation of food preservation. The first, the most important, and the method that made almost everything else possible was salt. Salt was the foundation of medieval food preservation, and it worked through a principle that medieval cooks understood in practice, even if they couldn't explain it scientifically. When you pack raw meat in salt or submerge it in a concentrated brine solution, the salt draws moisture out of the tissue. Bacteria need moisture to grow and multiply. By pulling the water out, the salt created an environment where the organisms responsible for spoilage simply couldn't survive. The meat would shrink, harden, and change texture, but it would last for months. Two main methods dominated medieval kitchens across Europe. Dry salting, packing the meat directly in layers of coarse salt, rubbing it into every surface, and letting it sit in barrels or stone crocks for days or weeks. A single pig slaughtered during the cold weeks of November might require 10 to 15 pounds of salt just to preserve the major cuts. Brine curing, mixing salt into water until the solution was so concentrated that an egg would float in it. The meat was then submerged completely and weighed down with stones to keep it below the surface. Both techniques demanded enormous quantities of salt and significant labor. On large estates, in monasteries, and in castles, specialized workers managed the salting process full-time during slaughter season. They turned and repacked the meat over days and weeks to ensure even preservation, checking constantly for any spots that had missed the salt. Even one small untreated area could allow rot to spread through an entire barrel. The smell alone could tell an experienced salt worker whether everything was going well, or whether something had gone wrong deep inside the crock. The results tasted extremely salty by modern standards. Historians believe that much of the preserved food was soaked in fresh water before cooking to pull some of that salt back out and restore a more palatable texture. And contrary to the popular image of medieval people eating nothing but dried, salty rations, most evidence suggests that fresh food still made up the majority of the diet whenever it was available. Salt preservation was the insurance policy, the backup for the months when fresh food simply didn't exist. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Salt trade and medieval power. Salt didn't just change how people ate. It changed how entire civilizations operated. The city of Salzburg in modern-day Austria literally means salt castle, and its wealth came directly from the salt mines in the surrounding Alps, where miners had been extracting salt for thousands of years. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, which began operating in the 13th century, grew so large and so profitable that miners carved entire underground chapels, sculptures, and even lakes out of the salt deposits. Today it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Venice built its mercantile empire in large part through its control of the Mediterranean salt trade. The Hanseatic League, that sprawling confederation of trading cities across northern and central Europe, shipped massive quantities of sea salt from southern France all the way to Scandinavia and Russia, earning staggering profits on every shipment. And in West Africa, salt from the mines of Tagaza was traded pound for pound with gold. The Mali Empire, one of the richest kingdoms in medieval history, built part of its wealth through this exchange. Salt roads stretched across the continent. One of the most famous salt routes in northern Germany ran from inland mines to coastal shipping ports. Knights who controlled sections of these roads could demand tolls from every salt merchant who passed through, and many of them grew wealthy from that single advantage. Monasteries invested heavily in salt production, knowing that a reliable salt supply meant food security for their communities year-round. Most people never hear about this part. Salt wasn't just a kitchen ingredient. It was a strategic resource as important to medieval geopolitics as oil is today. Wars were waged over salt deposits. Kingdoms rose and fell based on their access to it. And every barrel of salted pork, every cask of brined herring, and every jar of preserved vegetables sitting in a medieval pantry represented a tiny piece of that enormous economic engine. But salt alone wasn't enough. It handled moisture and slowed bacterial growth. Medieval kitchens needed more than one tool, so they turned to fire. Specifically, smoke. Smoking meat and fish. Smoking food for preservation dates back thousands of years before the medieval period. It was likely discovered by accident, when early humans noticed that meat hanging near a fire lasted longer than meat left in the open air. By the medieval era, however, the practice had evolved into a sophisticated craft. Dedicated smokehouses were common structures in towns and villages across England and continental Europe by the 1300s. In coastal communities, these smokehouses dealt primarily with fish. Inland, they focused on pork, since pigs were typically slaughtered in autumn and the meat needed to last through winter and into spring. The process usually started with salt. The meat or fish was cured first, rubbed down with salt or soaked in brine for anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. Then it was hung inside the smokehouse on wooden racks or iron hooks, where a low, smoldering fire produced dense smoke that surrounded the food for days or even weeks at a time. The type of wood mattered. Beech, oak, and alder were preferred across much of Europe because they burned slowly and produced a clean, dense smoke without excessive resin. The wrong wood, such as pine or spruce, could leave the food tasting bitter and coated in sticky sap residue. The smoke deposited chemical compounds onto the surface of the meat, compounds that scientists have since identified as including hundreds of different chemicals. Phenolic compounds slowed the oxidation of fat and helped prevent it from becoming rancid. Carbonyl compounds contributed to the distinctive color and flavor. And the overall drying effect of the heat and smoke pulled additional moisture from the meat, making it even more inhospitable to bacteria. Two distinct approaches existed. Cold smoking, done at relatively low temperatures, did not actually cook the meat. Instead, it dried and preserved the food slowly, sometimes over the course of 2 weeks or more. The result could be fish and meat that lasted for months under proper storage conditions. Hot smoking at higher temperatures cooked the food while also preserving it. However, the results generally did not keep quite as long. Different communities developed their own techniques, but smoking was particularly valuable for long-term storage. In medieval England, smokehouses could serve entire communities. They were sometimes shared structures, with communal ownership or arrangements between households. The responsibility for preserving enough food for the whole village depended, at least in part, on how well these buildings functioned. A properly maintained smokehouse could mean the difference between having food throughout the winter and facing hunger when the stored harvest began to run low. The fish would be moved and hung in different sections of the smoker throughout the process, ensuring even exposure to the smoke. A properly cold smoked fish, cured with salt beforehand, could last for a year or more if stored in cool, dry conditions. Religious fasting rules drove an enormous demand for smoked and preserved fish across medieval Europe. The Catholic Church prohibited the eating of meat on Fridays during Lent and on dozens of other holy days throughout the year. That meant European Christians needed a reliable year-round supply of fish. And since most people lived far from the coast, that fish had to be preserved. Enormous quantities of herring and salmon were salted and smoked in seaside towns along the coasts of England, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, then shipped inland on carts and barges. It was an entire industry, and it fed millions. For households that couldn't afford a dedicated smokehouse, a simpler approach worked. They hung salted meat high above the hearth or fireplace inside their own homes, letting the smoke from their daily cooking fire do the work overnight. Ashes were piled over the embers to kill the flames and produce a thick, slow smoke. It wasn't as controlled or consistent as a proper smokehouse, but it helped keep families fed through the darkest months. Now, salt pulled moisture out of food to slow bacterial growth. Smoke coated food with protective compounds that helped do the same thing. But fermentation did something completely different. Fermentation, pickling, and cheese. Instead of fighting bacteria, medieval fermentation worked with them. Medieval people didn't know about microorganisms. They had no concept of lactic acid bacteria, yeast colonies, or the biochemical processes we now understand in precise detail. But they knew, through centuries of observation and practice, that certain transformations made food safer, more durable, and often more flavorful. A head of cabbage submerged in salted brine would bubble and sour over a few weeks, then remain edible for months. Milk left in the right conditions would curdle into cheese that lasted far longer than the liquid it came from. Grain mixed with water and left to ferment became ale. Grapes became wine. Apples became cider. Honey became mead. And dough left to develop a natural sour culture became bread that could keep better than some unleavened flatbreads. All of these processes relied on the same underlying principle. Beneficial microorganisms, the ones that produced alcohol, lactic acid, or acetic acid, outcompete and suppressed many of the harmful microorganisms that caused spoilage. The acidic environment they created was essentially inhospitable to many dangerous pathogens. Medieval cooks didn't understand the mechanism, but they understood the results perfectly. Monasteries became important centers of fermentation knowledge in medieval Europe. Benedictine monks, known for their emphasis on agricultural self-sufficiency, refined techniques for brewing ale, making cheese, producing vinegar, and fermenting vegetables as part of their daily provisioning and charitable work. The abbey cellar, overseen by a designated cellarer, was one of the most important rooms in many monasteries. Illuminated manuscripts from the period show monks testing wine, inspecting barrels, and managing fermentation processes with obvious care and expertise. Pickling, a close cousin of fermentation, used vinegar or strong brine to preserve both meat and vegetables. Medieval pickled foods were simpler than many of the varieties we see today, relying on basic combinations of vinegar, salt, and sometimes sugar or honey. But the range of applications was wide. You could pickle anything from cucumbers and onions to cuts of pork and beef. Because of vinegar's acidity, the food was protected from many spoilage microorganisms in much the same way that fermented foods were, just through a different chemical pathway. The importance of cheese. Cheese deserves a special mention because dairy animals in the medieval world produced unevenly throughout the year. Cows and goats gave the most milk in spring and summer, when pasture was lush, and much less in winter. A single cow could produce several gallons of milk daily during the peak months, far more than a household could drink before it soured. Turning that surplus into cheese was one of the best ways to store its nutritional value for the lean months ahead. The process involved adding rennet, an enzyme traditionally obtained from the stomach lining of young calves, to warm milk, causing it to separate into solid curds and liquid whey. The curds were then pressed, salted, and aged under carefully controlled conditions. A wheel of hard, aged cheese could last for years under the right conditions, making it one of the most efficient preservation strategies available to medieval households. Soft, fresh cheeses had to be eaten within days. But a well-made aged cheese, stored in a cool cellar and turned regularly, could outlast nearly any other preserved food in the medieval pantry. And every region developed its own styles and techniques. The caves of Roquefort in southern France, the alpine dairies of Switzerland, and the monastery cellars of the Low Countries, each one produced cheese with distinct flavors shaped by local milk, local bacteria, local climate, and generations of accumulated knowledge. That is why Europe today has hundreds of distinct cheese varieties, most of them tracing their origins back to the medieval period or earlier. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, pulling apart the history behind things most people take for granted. Root cellars and underground cooling. By the 1300s, medieval builders had refined another preservation strategy that required no salt, no smoke, and no fermentation at all. They went underground. Root cellars and underground storage chambers were built beneath castles, manor houses, monasteries, and even modest farmhouses across Europe. The principle was simple and effective. Below a certain depth, the earth maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round, cooler than the summer air above and warmer than the freezing winter surface. A properly constructed root cellar kept its contents at temperatures roughly equivalent to a cool modern refrigerator, somewhere around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, without any mechanical assistance. Medieval root cellars in England and France were typically constructed from stone or brick, built into hillsides or carved beneath existing structures. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate slowly, preventing the buildup of moisture and mold. Drainage systems directed water away from stored food. Root vegetables, apples, pears, barrels of cider, crocks of preserved meat, and wheels of aging cheese all found their way into these underground rooms. In Scandinavia, the approach was different but equally clever. Earth cellars were dug directly into the ground and covered with thick layers of soil and sod for insulation. A narrow, sloping tunnel served as the entrance, designed specifically to trap cold air inside during winter and block warm air during summer. These Scandinavian earth cellars were remarkably effective at storing root vegetables and fermented foods like sauerkraut, keeping them crisp and edible for months. Castle kitchens took underground storage to another level entirely. The great stone keeps of medieval England and France often had multiple levels of cellars, each designated for a different purpose. One for wine, one for ale, one for salted meats, one for root vegetables and grain. The castle at Windsor, the Tower of London, and fortress complexes across France all maintained extensive underground storage networks that could provision a garrison through months of siege if necessary. The constable of a well-run castle knew exactly how many barrels of salt pork, how many casks of ale, and how many sacks of grain were in his cellars at any given time. These supplies were carefully inventoried and tracked because running out of provisions during a siege could mean surrender. For the wealthiest medieval households, cold storage went even further. Ice houses appeared in various forms across Europe, structures designed to store blocks of ice harvested from frozen lakes and rivers during winter. Packed in straw and sawdust for insulation, this ice could last well into summer, providing a level of cooling that came surprisingly close to actual refrigeration. In the warmer Mediterranean world, snow from mountain peaks was a traded commodity. Wealthy households in cities, royal courts, and merchant estates paid to have snow and ice transported down from the highlands for cooling drinks, preparing medicines, and extending the life of perishable foods during the hottest months. These ice houses and snow cellars were rare luxuries. They required significant labor, land, and resources to build and maintain. The vast majority of medieval people relied on simpler underground storage. But the fact that these systems existed at all tells you something important about how seriously medieval societies took the problem of food preservation, and how creative they were willing to get in solving it. But underground rooms kept food cool. They didn't stop it from spoiling entirely. For that, medieval cooks had another method, one that sealed food away from the air itself: confit potting and fat sealing. In the Gascony region of southwestern France, farmers raised large numbers of ducks and geese. During the long winter months, when fresh food became scarce, they developed a preservation technique that would eventually become one of the most celebrated methods in French cuisine. They called it confit, from the French word confire, meaning to preserve. The process was straightforward and effective. First, the meat was rubbed generously with salt and left to cure for a day or two. Then it was slowly cooked in its own rendered fat at a low temperature, sometimes for hours, until it was completely tender. Once cooked, the meat was packed tightly into clay crocks or earthenware jars, and the remaining hot fat was poured over the top until the meat was entirely submerged. As the fat cooled, it solidified into an airtight seal. No oxygen could reach the meat beneath. No bacteria could penetrate the barrier. Stored in a cool cellar, a properly made confit could keep for 6 months or longer without significant spoilage. Over time, during the Middle Ages, this technique gained recognition well beyond Gascon farmhouses. French nobility discovered that confit was not just a preservation method, but a culinary technique that produced extraordinarily tender, flavorful meat. Duck confit, goose confit, and pork confit became dishes associated with wealth and refinement, even though they had originated out of pure necessity in rural kitchens. A related method, known as potting, spread across England and northern Europe. Potted meat involved cooking the meat slowly, shredding or pounding it, and then packing it tightly into crocks sealed with a thick layer of clarified butter or rendered lard. The fat created the same kind of protective barrier as confit, and potted meats could be stored for weeks or months in a cool space. The word larder, which we still use today to describe a food storage room, comes from the Old French lardier, referring to a place where lard and preserved meats were stored. No one in the 1200s could have explained why this worked in scientific terms. They didn't know about anaerobic conditions or the role of oxygen in bacterial growth. They simply knew that meat sealed under fat stayed good, while meat left exposed to the open air went bad. Practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next, doing the work of microbiology centuries before anyone had a microscope. And then there was honey. Honey, sugar, and natural preservation. Medieval beekeepers understood something about honey that modern science has since confirmed in detail. Honey has natural antimicrobial properties. Its extremely low moisture content, usually around 17 to 18% water, and its mildly acidic pH create an environment where many bacteria struggle to grow. On top of that, honey can produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide as a natural byproduct, which contributes to its antimicrobial effects. Medieval cooks exploited these properties by coating fruits, and occasionally other foods, in thick layers of honey. The honey formed a protective barrier against outside contamination while also making the environment unfavorable for many microorganisms already present on the food surface. Stone crocks of honey-preserved fruits could sit in a cellar for months without obvious signs of spoilage. Archaeologists have famously recovered honey from ancient Egyptian tombs that remained remarkably well preserved after thousands of years. And medieval people, while they didn't know the scientific explanation behind honey's preservative properties, certainly understood that honey-preserved foods could last remarkably long. Sugar served a similar function, but it was far more expensive and much less widely available than honey throughout most of the medieval period. Sugar arrived in Europe primarily through trade with the Islamic world and did not become a regular presence in wealthier European kitchens until the 13th and 14th centuries. Even then, it was treated more like a spice or luxury ingredient than a staple, measured out carefully and used sparingly. Honey remained the sweetener and preservative of choice for ordinary households across much of medieval Europe, and beekeeping was a valued skill. Monasteries in particular practiced it with great dedication, both for the honey and for the beeswax used to make church candles. Drying fish, fruit, and grain. Drying was perhaps the oldest and simplest preservation technique of all. Medieval communities across northern Europe relied on it heavily. In Scandinavia and along the coasts of Norway and Iceland, cod was air-dried outdoors on large wooden racks in the cold, dry wind for months at a time. The Lofoten Islands, off the coast of Norway, became one of the great centers of stockfish production. Fishermen hung thousands of split cod on open-air wooden frames called gel, where the Arctic wind did much of the work. The finished product was so thoroughly dehydrated that it became rock-hard, light enough to carry in large quantities, and remarkably resistant to spoilage. Stockfish could be stored for years under suitable conditions and transported thousands of miles without spoiling. Soaked in water for several days before cooking, it rehydrated into something reasonably close to fresh fish. It became a staple food across medieval Europe. Enormous quantities were traded by Hanseatic merchants, who shipped it from Scandinavian ports to markets in the Low Countries, England, and as far south as the Mediterranean. Stockfish fed armies. It provisioned ships on long voyages. It appeared on tables during Lent in households that had never seen the ocean. And the trade in dried fish generated enough wealth to help make the coastal towns of Norway among the more prosperous trading centers in northern Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries. Fruits and herbs were dried in the sun or in warm rooms near kitchen hearths. Grains were stored in dry conditions after threshing. Their naturally low moisture content made them resistant to spoilage, as long as they were kept away from rain, excessive humidity, insects, and rodents. Even meat could be dried into jerky-like strips when conditions were right. Though this was more common in warmer, drier climates than in the damp conditions of northern Europe. Medieval methods still used today. Every one of these techniques, salting, smoking, fermenting, cooling, sealing in fat, coating in honey, and drying in the wind, solved the same fundamental problem from a different angle. And the most remarkable thing about them is how many of these methods are still with us today. Prosciutto is still salt-cured, much like the way Italian butchers cured pork centuries ago. Smoked salmon follows the same basic principles that medieval Scandinavian fishermen used. Sauerkraut sits on grocery store shelves across Europe, made through the same lactic fermentation that medieval communities relied on to get through winter. Duck confit appears on restaurant menus in Paris, New York, and Tokyo, prepared using essentially the same preservation technique that Gascon farmers developed out of necessity centuries ago. Aged cheddar, Gouda, Gruyere, Parmesan, all of them exist because generations of cheesemakers figured out how to turn perishable milk into something that could last for months or even years. And then there's beer. Every pint of beer we drink today is part of a brewing tradition with roots stretching deep into medieval Europe, where brewing was also an important way of processing and storing grain. Grain stored in its raw form could last a long time, but grain transformed into ale could be stored in barrels and in some circumstances, provide a safer beverage than questionable water sources in crowded medieval settlements. Monasteries brewed on a large scale, and the traditions they helped develop eventually became part of a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. How preservation shaped Europe. The medieval kitchen didn't have a refrigerator. What it had was a collection of preservation methods refined over centuries of experimentation, failure, hunger, and ingenuity. These techniques transformed seasonal abundance into year-round sustenance. They shaped trade routes that stretched from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa. They helped build the fortunes of Venice, Salzburg, and the Hanseatic ports. They helped fund armies, provision ships, and feed the growing cities that would eventually become the foundations of modern Europe. Food preservation wasn't simply a collection of kitchen tricks. It was part of the infrastructure of medieval civilization. Without reliable ways to store food, long-distance trade would have been far more difficult. Armies could not have traveled as easily. Ships could not have remained at sea for extended periods. and growing cities would have struggled to feed their populations through the seasons. Preservation allowed food to move through time and across distance, and that changed everything. So, the next time you slice into a piece of aged cheese, pull a jar of pickles from the shelf, spread honey onto your bread, or bite into a strip of beef jerky, remember that you're experiencing a tradition with roots stretching back centuries. A medieval cook might not recognize your refrigerator, supermarket, or modern kitchen, but they would recognize the principle immediately. The technology changed. The principle never did. Asterisk asterisk. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part of this entire story. The people of the Middle Ages didn't have modern science, refrigeration, or food processing equipment, but they had something just as important: observation, patience, and generations of accumulated knowledge. They learned how to work with salt, smoke, air, cold, heat, microorganisms, and time. And those discoveries helped shape not only what medieval Europeans ate, but how their entire societies survived and prospered. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden history behind everyday food, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us in the comments, which medieval preservation method surprised you the most? If you'd like to explore another everyday invention with a history just as fascinating, that video is waiting for you on screen now. Until next time, keep exploring the past.